It's a really special time to be a Spider-Man fan. I grew up with Tobey, I was a teenager with Andrew, and now I'm a young adult with Tom. I've seen 3 generations of the character and I've grown alongside him. Marvel, you have the great power to do something remarkable here, but with it comes the great responsibility to do right by it. This movie can choose to do the bare minimum for some quick money, or it can be a fantastical, heartfelt ode to the character in all the ways that we've grown to love him since his first true cinematic debut in 2002. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility. How did I spend my summer vacation? I can sum it up in one glorious hyphenated word: Spider-Man. Months of anticipation, months of leaks, months of questions. All the while, Andrew's fighting for his life in those interviews for Tick Tick Boom.
I'm not the werewolf.
Ever since we got our first taste for this being a multiversal event, I was concerned that Marvel was gonna find a way to weaponize our nostalgia. Honestly, I thought that they could have been really cheap and dishonest about it and given us the bare minimum and plug as many "hey, remember this" kind of moments just for the sake of nostalgia, while missing why those moments are revered. And while there is a moment or two where the film does lose its way slightly with those contrived callbacks, it is mostly a wholehearted love letter to what's come before it, while using that material to tell a new story. Marvel's worst kept secret was Tobey and Andrew's appearance, and honestly, genius tactic by excluding them from every promotional material.
I promise you I am not the werewolf.
Maybe it's too early to tell right now, because I'm conflicted. On one half, this event of a story was thrilling, unlike any Spider-Man media I've ever seen. The emotional resonance of it all just clicked with me. But don't confuse my words here, because it didn't click with me the same way that Spider-Man 2 does, or Into the Spider-Verse. It did certainly click with me, but it was for an emotionally different reason that I haven't quite determined yet. Because on the other half, it felt like a shallow, yet perfectly serviceable, shameless shell of what worked before. It didn't quite add so much to the existing material, but I don't think it needed to. What it did do for the Sinister 5 was certainly not what I was expecting, but I honestly really kind of vibe with it. Tom's Peter has the resources to help these villains rehabilitate and spare them their lethal fates, and I think that that is a twist on what we've seen before with the previous adaptations, and it works for entirely its own reason. I don't think there's a definitive answer here, but I will say that for any amount of that shrewd shallowness, there is a heart behind it that cares about delivering something unlike anything we've ever seen. Maybe it missed its mark, maybe it hit every checkbox that you wanted to see. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's entirely your call to make. A conflicting standout moment to me was Goblin reciting his most meme-worthy line.
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
Yeah, it's a bit of fun. And while half of me laughed and enjoyed the callback, the other half was a little threatened by such a bold immersion break for the sake of a joke. It again pops up in the finale with a certain someone's back problems, but it then evolves into a very entertaining, silly moment between two characters that I adore as they do something very un-Spider-Man-like, but very human. It felt like a gag straight from Into the Spider-Verse, and I really loved it. But the underlying grievance that I had with this was that it was an indicator that they had no shame in plugging meme material for the sake of a cheap laugh over the tone of a scene, but thankfully, as I discussed before, those moments are far outweighed by the brilliance of the rest of the film. I was specifically concerned about this because, as I highlighted in a video leading up to this film, my main concern was bringing these previous versions of Spider-Man back and doing nothing with them. And honestly, I would have rather they did nothing with them than ruin their legacies. But in this case, they were done perfectly. They didn't overstay any welcomes, though that would be tough because I would have happily sat through more of the 3 of them. But the main thing is that their use in the story was both relevant and honest. There was no need to compromise who these Spider-Man are, or were. They were constructive additions to Tom's story while being equally as faithful to their respective material and injected a bit of their own unique flavors that made their adaptations so iconic. Now, though I haven't really given myself a chance to be vocal about it, I've been a fan of The Amazing Spider-Man since day one. It was actually the very first Spider-Man movie I saw in cinema, and I can still recall the midnight showing in 2012 when I was just 10. Every emotion that I experienced with Andrew being my first exposure to Spider-Man in the cinemas came straight back to me in that final third act. It was a surreal feeling being back in a cinema watching The Amazing Spider-Man again, unfortunately accompanied by an assembly of people confidently flouting COVID restrictions.
No one seems to grasp the concept of the mask.
Please be safe while watching this film. Yeah, I howled alongside an energetic crowd when the werewolf himself made his highly anticipated return. From the moment he turned up in that delicious TASM 2 outfit that still outsells every other Spider-Man costume, I was incredibly happy. The bug-eyed lenses looking through the portal with a sense of reserved intrigue, that distinctly unique quirk that Andrew gave the character, it's immediately identifiable. I love Tobey Maguire, but his Spider-Man arc is finished, and it's reflected here. Tobey has nothing to gain and nothing to lose in No Way Home. He is there for our sakes as fans, and I'm grateful for it. Andrew, however, had one more arc to complete, and I promise you that I'll be doing further coverage on that in a bigger video later this year. Because he has a single moment in this movie that is damn near one of, if not my absolute favorite cinematic Spider-Man setup and payoff of all time, and I don't think the movies can ever come close to matching how I felt in that moment. See, I'm usually a very stoic, hardened moviegoer, a masculine enjoyer of cinema whose effeminate emotions don't leak through. I'm of course joking, I'm very secure with myself, and I don't think it's a problem when I admit that the entire third act of Spider-Man No Way Home had me crying like a little punk bitch. So while I think everything with the returning Spider-Man is near perfect, I'm conflicted because my assessment of this multiversal band of villains can be summed up in 3 words. Brilliant but lazy. Spectacular that we saw them all return, for sure. Willem Dafoe continually proves that he's the penultimate Green Goblin, threatening enough to challenge both Tobey and Tom to such a glorious degree as he travels the multiverse trying to, I don't know, legalize weed. Alfred I'm Up For Anything Molina, back as his iconic Doc Ock, still retaining the heart of what made his character work so well in 2004.
For me, it's just about the money.
Happy to pay the bills, Otto.
And Jamie Foxx coming back with a very new take on Max Dillon. It's all fantastic, it's utter brilliance, but I can't help but wonder what this film would have been like seeing Tom tackle an assembly of his own villains with the help of Tobey and Andrew. In that respect, I find it a little lazy to have relied on what's come before it to carry those stakes through, but again, it's hard to critique it because it's just so very brilliant. That's what I took away from Spider-Man No Way Home. I really enjoyed Tom's story here, and I'm excited to see what's next. Give us something akin to the heart of Spectacular Spider-Man, and you've got yourself a phenomenal foundation for the character. And maybe with time, I'll warm to truly appreciating what he had to offer throughout the film, enough to supplement another Spider-Man video. But for now, what is at the forefront of my mind is how genius and genuine the use of nostalgia was here. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't contrived, it was fun, then it was compelling. And if you give me a Spider-Verse movie where the failures of a previous Spider-Man define him and allow him to forgive himself, then it's exactly that kind of maturity that I want people to take away from this character. The sum of those parts made Spider-Man No Way Home, for me, such a heartfelt love letter to the other adaptations while using them thematically to elevate Tom's Spidey to a level of maturity and independence that we hadn't yet seen. I am beyond satisfied with the treatment of all of these returning characters that I grew up with, hero, villain, or otherwise. The treatment of Tobey Maguire in this film reminded me of the lessons of humility and empathy that I grew up on, and allowed me to revisit the iconography of my childhood that defined my outlook on storytelling. The treatment of Andrew Garfield in this film taught me what it means to love Spider-Man again. I am beyond satisfied with the conclusion of Tom's journey as a high schooler Spider-Man and transition into an independent young adult. If they make more of these movies, then they've laid a fascinating foundation for development here, and I'm now in a position where I'm satisfied with the conclusion of one journey and excited for the commencement of another. That's something that I haven't felt for Spider-Man since before 2014. Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man was about empathy. It was about remaining humble and trying to do the right thing until the very end. It was about failing, forgiving, and loving with honesty. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man was about loneliness. It was about being the wallflower and projecting confidence to the people who need it. It was about maturity, grief, and hope. Tom Holland's Spider-Man distinguished himself by being the Spider-Man who existed in a world of heroes and struggled with independence. Consequently, Tom Holland's Spider-Man had the most to prove. He was the one who saw these villains as victims of circumstance and empathized with their misfortune. He vowed to help them, and he was able to follow through with doing what the other Spider-Man couldn't. He was able to save them from themselves. The Spider-Verse event guided him to maturing into his own Spider-Man, independent from the legacy of Stark, removed from the shadow of the Avengers. Now, New York's one and only Spider-Man, a Spider-Man matured by his pain, humbled by his power, and strengthened by his responsibility. Everyone, thanks for sticking around. So a portion of this video was actually edited by my good friend CJ over at That One Doesn't Count. I've got a link to him on the screen there and he'll be in the description. Go check him a sub. He's a really good editor and he helped me out here. I was under a lot of crunch for this video and he really came in clutch and helps me out. So thank you very much, CJ.